In the stillness of night, when the world becomes quiet and distractions fade, he remembers you. Maybe it's the way you laughed. Maybe it's the silence you shared without needing to fill it. Maybe it's just your name flashing in his mind like a distant lighthouse across the waters of memory. But still, he doesn't call, and this absence is not the absence of thought. It is not forgetfulness, it is hesitation born from a much deeper place than the surface mind. You see, the mind is a machine of ceaseless activity. It clings to ideas, cycles through memories, and nudges, rewinds, imagines. It can think of you 100 times a day effortlessly. But the soul, it is slower. It is more ancient. It carries weight, meaning, and shadow. It doesn't merely think, it feels. And when something is felt deeply, it isn't always acted upon. In fact, the more profound the feeling, the greater the resistance to exposing it. That is the paradox of the human condition. He can think of you with warmth, with curiosity, with longing, and yet find himself paralyzed by an invisible force. He tells himself, "I'll reach out tomorrow." And when tomorrow arrives, his fingers hover above the phone, but never press the call button. Why? Because something inside him recoils, not from you, but from what your voice might awaken in him. He has placed you in a delicate part of his inner world, one where he's allowed to revisit you in private, like reading an old letter he never had the courage to send. In that space, you remain untouchable, almost sacred. To break that silence by calling you would risk disrupting the order he's built around his emotional life. It would require him to face not only you, but himself, because the truth is, when someone truly matters, when their presence touches us deeply, it doesn't always inspire immediate action. In fact, it often does the opposite. It humbles us, it shakes the ego. It makes us question the roles we play, the armor we wear, and the stories we've told ourselves about who we are. If he calls you, he must first ask himself, what do I want to say? What if she doesn't feel the same? What if this conversation reveals how much I've changed or haven't changed at all? This inner questioning is not superficial, it is existential, because to call is not just to connect, it is to be seen. And there are few things more terrifying than being seen by someone who once knew you intimately. What if you see through the mask he now wears? What if you speak to the part of him he has spent years trying to silence? So he thinks of you again and again, often in moments when he feels alone, uncertain, or nostalgic. But then the hesitation arrives like a shadow creeping across the floor. It tells him, don't disrupt this. Don't open that door. It's safer to leave it untouched. People often mistake silence for disinterest. They imagine that if someone doesn't call, it must mean they've moved on or stopped caring. But the soul is not linear. It doesn't operate on timelines or expectations. It responds to symbols, emotions, and wounds that have never been named. He may very well think of you more than anyone else in his life, and yet still, his phone remains untouched. Because what you represent is not just a memory. You represent vulnerability. You represent truth. You represent a time when he may have felt more alive, more connected, and perhaps more afraid. He remembers even if he doesn't speak, and this remembrance lives not just in thoughts, but in dreams, in unconscious triggers, in songs he skips because they bring you too close. To you, it may seem like nothing is happening, but internally there is a quiet storm, a soul negotiating with its own defenses. A man wrestling not just with whether or not to call you, but with whether or not he is ready to be that version of himself again. There is a reason ancient traditions spoke of the mind and the soul as separate forces. The mind is quick, sharp, filled with imagery and logic. It sends reminders, paints scenarios, imagines how the conversation would go. But the soul, it hesitates, because it knows that some doors once opened cannot be closed. Some truths once spoken cannot be reburied. And some people once reached out to will no longer exist in the realm of fantasy. They will become real again, with all their light and all their consequence. There is a deep terror that lives beneath the surface of the human experience, one that is rarely spoken of, but profoundly felt. It is not the fear of rejection that keeps him silent. It is something older, more primal, more difficult to name. It is the fear of being seen. To call you would not be a casual act. It would not simply be about checking in or making conversation. It would be an unveiling. It would mean stepping out of the shadows and into a space where his soul is no longer protected by distance, silence, or ambiguity. That single call would be a confrontation, one that requires courage, and more importantly, a readiness to expose his inner world. But exposure, for someone carrying unresolved emotions or wounds, feels like danger. There are people who long for love but fear intimacy. They crave connection but shrink at the possibility of being known, because to be known means to be without defense. It means someone might see beyond the carefully constructed persona, the one built out of years of survival, performance, and pride. In you, he might see the one person who could truly understand him, but that also means you could truly hurt him. And so even if he aches to hear your voice, the fear of what that voice might awaken becomes greater than the desire. He tells himself stories. She probably doesn't want to hear from me. What would I even say? It's been too long. But beneath these excuses is a far deeper truth. When you mattered to him, you held up a mirror. In your presence, he glimpsed pieces of himself he hadn't fully understood, maybe even parts he wasn't ready to face. And that mirror, now held in memory, still has the power to reflect him back to himself. That is the fear, not you, but what he might see in himself when he's with you. We are conditioned from early life to wear masks. Masks of strength, composure, logic, detachment. Especially for men, vulnerability is a currency often discouraged. Be strong, they are told. Don't feel too much, don't want too much. And so they learn to perform strength even when it isolates them. They learn to suppress longing even when it starves them. They learn to think of people like you in silence. Because to speak, to reach out, would require the dismantling of those masks. In the quiet of his heart, he knows that calling you wouldn't just be a simple act. It would open up old pathways. It would flood the present with memory, with possibility, with uncertainty, and with that comes risk. Because what if you don't feel the same anymore? What if you've moved on? What if your voice now holds indifference? But even more terrifying, what if you do still feel something? What if your voice still has the power to shake him, soften him, disarm him? Then what? That question lingers like smoke in the air, because to be disarmed is to lose control. To be softened is to become vulnerable, and to become vulnerable is to risk unraveling years of emotional suppression. He's not sure if he can hold that much truth all at once, so he waits, he stays silent, not because you don't matter, but because you matter too much. In you, he sees the person who didn't just like him for the image he projected. You saw beneath. Maybe you saw the chaos behind the calm, the doubt behind the confidence, the hurt behind the detachment. And now, the thought of reaching out brings with it the weight of that recognition. Because what if you still see through him? What if your voice calls forward emotions he thought he had buried? What if your presence reawakens longings he spent years numbing? The fear of being seen is not cowardice. It is the defense of someone who once showed their soul and didn't know what to do with what came after. Perhaps he opened up before to someone else and it ended in pain. Perhaps he was taught that showing emotion is weakness. Perhaps he simply doesn't trust himself with the depth of feeling you evoke. And so, his silence becomes a shield, a way to maintain control, a way to preserve the distance that protects him from the vulnerability of truly being known. To speak with you would mean stepping out from behind the curtain. No more pretense, no more performance, just truth, raw and unrehearsed. It's easier to stay silent. It's easier to let the mind revisit you in private, where nothing is risked, where everything can remain imagined, safe, unbroken. The thought of you lives in a carefully sealed chamber of his heart, one that he visits when no one is looking, when he feels brave enough to remember, but not brave enough to act. Because to act would require not just a call, but a confrontation with who he truly is and who he might become in your presence. There is an ancient story etched into the soul of humanity, a story that is not told in words, but lived out through behavior, silence, and hesitation. It is the story of the wounded masculine. This archetype does not belong to just one man, but rather echoes through generations, cultures, and histories. It lives in the man who loves but cannot express it. It lives in the man who wants to reach out, but doesn't. It lives in the man who thinks of you deeply and often, yet never picks up the phone. To understand his silence, one must understand the deep fracture within him, the disconnection between his longing and his ability to act on it. From a young age, many boys are taught to suppress the very traits that make connection possible. Vulnerability is discouraged, emotion is policed, sensitivity is mocked. The boy learns quickly to survive in this world, he must armor himself. And so he begins to build that armor, Layer by layer, experience by experience. What begins as protection eventually becomes a prison. He forgets how to feel safely. He forgets how to ask for what he needs. He learns instead to hide behind competence, control, and withdrawal. By the time this boy becomes a man, he is often praised for his strength, his composure, his ability to remain unaffected. But beneath that surface lies the wound. A wound that says, you are not allowed to be soft. A wound that whispers, a love is dangerous. And when he encounters someone like you, someone who invites him to feel deeply, who sees past the mask, who reminds him of what it means to be fully human, the wound is awakened. He thinks of you not just because he misses you, but because something about you calls to that buried, exiled part of him. The part that still wants to feel, still wants to be held, still wants to be known, but wanting and allowing are not the same. He may long for closeness but find himself pulling away from it. He may wish to call you, to hear your voice, to reconnect, but then retreat into silence. This is not because the feeling isn't real. It is because the feeling is too real. The wounded masculine fears what he cannot control. And love in its truest form is chaos. It is uncontainable. It brings joy but also exposure. And for someone who has spent a lifetime managing exposure, managing perception, managing pain, the unpredictable nature of love can feel like a threat. In this archetype, love and fear coexist. When he thinks of you, he is not indifferent. He is conflicted. You represent both the light he desires and the shadow he avoids. You remind him of who he was before he became guarded. Maybe you knew him in a time when he was still soft, still curious, still open. Or maybe you simply touched something in him that others never could. And now, even from a distance, you still have that power. That is why he doesn't call. Because to call is to admit that he still feels. And to feel is to admit that the armor was never enough. There is a mythology he carries about himself, that he must always be strong, always be composed, always be in control. And within that mythology, reaching out can feel like failure. Failure. It means needing. It means risking rejection. It means facing the parts of himself he has kept hidden, not only from others, but from himself. This mythology is not something he consciously chooses. It is a survival story passed down through fathers, uncles, media, culture. It tells him, don't feel. Don't need. Don't reach out unless you know you'll win. But love is not war. There is no winning, only surrender. And surrender is the very thing his story forbids. So he remains still. He plays the role he's been taught. Perhaps he distracts himself with work, achievements, casual connections, anything that keeps him from confronting the rawness of what you represent. But in the quiet moments, when the distractions fade, your image returns. And he is faced again with that same internal pull, the desire to connect clashing with the fear of being undone. That is the tragedy of the wounded masculine. He feels deeply but is unable to move freely. His heart is not empty, it is imprisoned. You may see his silence as a lack of care, but in reality it is the behavior of a soul at war with itself. He cannot reconcile who he was taught to be with what he actually feels. He cannot find a bridge between his longing and his action. And so he remains trapped in the space between thought and voice, between memory and motion, between wanting and calling. Beneath the silence, beneath the stillness of a man who does not call, lies a psychological phenomenon that governs much of human behavior without ever announcing itself. Emotional paralysis. This is not laziness. It is not indifference. It is not even fear in its simplest form. It is the slow, invisible grip of the unconscious, an internal tyranny that renders him unable to act, even when the desire to do so burns within him. He may think of you with longing. He may imagine the sound of your voice, the way your presence once made the world feel less fragmented. But the moment he considers reaching out, something constricts within. It is not just hesitation. It is something deeper, more ancient. He doesn't even always recognize it. It presents itself as a fog, a strange weight in the chest, an inner noise that drowns out clarity. This is emotional paralysis. It is not a decision made at the level of thought, but a reaction rooted in the unseen parts of the psyche. The unconscious is not silent. It speaks through dreams, through impulse, through avoidance, through unexplained sadness or bursts of anger. When the unconscious carries unresolved wounds, those wounds become guardians. They whisper, "Don't move." They whisper, "Protect yourself." And they do this even when there is no visible threat. You may not be a threat. You may be kind, open, even longing too. But the unconscious does not differentiate between the past and the present. It only remembers the emotion tied to the pattern. Perhaps in his past, vulnerability was punished. Maybe in childhood, reaching out led to shame, abandonment, or betrayal. Perhaps he was once emotionally open with someone who used that openness to wound him. These early blueprints don't fade. They sink deep. They become part of the architecture of his internal world. So now, as an adult, the mere thought of calling you pulls him back into that ancient emotional terrain. It's not about you. It's about what you unconsciously represent. A mirror, a chance, a potential opening, and thus a potential fall. In emotional paralysis, the conflict is not between caring and not caring. It is between caring deeply and not knowing how to carry the weight of that care. To reach out to you would mean disrupting the fragile equilibrium he has managed to construct. He has likely built a life structured around avoidance, around detachment disguised as independence, around safety disguised as strength. You threaten that construct, not because you are harmful, but because your presence demands authenticity. And the unconscious, when ruled by fear and past trauma, resists authenticity at all costs. There is also a darker truth. Many people are addicted to their suffering, not because they enjoy it, but because it is familiar. The pain becomes a kind of comfort, a known territory. It is easier to stay in longing, to remain in the role of the silent dreamer, than it is to risk the unknown of connection. Longing, after all, is a solitary activity. It is safe, it is controlled. You can replay the same memory over and over and shape it into something beautiful. But to actually engage with the present, to make the call, to hear the response, to step into real time, is terrifying because the present is unpredictable. It cannot be controlled. It demands presence. Emotional paralysis is not passivity, it is exhaustion. It is the exhaustion of someone carrying too much unspoken emotion, too many unmet needs, too many memories that have never been processed. The psyche becomes like a body locked in tension. It wants to move, but every signal to do so is met with an equal and opposite force. This internal war does not play out loudly. It shows itself in subtle behaviors. Procrastination, self-sabotage, sudden coldness, vague excuses. But beneath all of it is the soul quietly screaming for resolution. Even the act of imagining the phone call is heavy. And not because he doesn't want to speak, but because of everything that such a moment would require. It would require him to open the door to a flood of feeling that he has no idea how to contain. What would he say? How would he explain his silence? What if the words came out wrong? What if you misunderstood? What if he misunderstood himself? The unconscious does not seek progress, it seeks safety. And safety to the wounded man often means stasis. Better to stay stuck in place than to risk further harm. This is the logic of trauma. This is the structure of emotional paralysis. And so though he thinks of you, perhaps even every day, he remains in the grip of an inner force stronger than intention. His thoughts travel freely, but his voice is caught in the web of a deeper silence. There exists a peculiar phenomenon in the human psyche, one that gives the illusion of intimacy while preserving complete emotional distance. It is the world of projection and fantasy, the theater of the mind where we replay scenes, rewrite conversations, and resurrect lost possibilities. For the man who thinks of you but doesn't call, this inner theater becomes a substitute for real contact. In his imagination, he speaks to you. In his dreams, he holds you. In silence, he maintains a connection that never demands courage, vulnerability, or risk. This fantasy becomes so vivid that over time it feels more comfortable than reality itself. Projection is not simply imagining someone. It is the act of placing our own inner content, our desires, fears, regrets, and needs onto another person. He doesn't just think of you as you are. He thinks of you as he needs you to be. In his mind, you may be the one who understands him without words, who forgives him without question, who remains emotionally present without requiring action from him in return. You are idealized, elevated, transformed into a symbolic figure. This projection comforts him because you are no longer a real person who might disappoint him or hold him accountable. You are now part of his internal world, a version of you that reflects his longings and eases his guilt. In this imagined connection, he can feel close to you without confronting the truth of your absence. He may scroll through your photos, reread old messages, revisit shared memories. He may play out hypothetical conversations in his head where everything goes perfectly. And each time he does, He strengthens the illusion of intimacy. He convinces himself that the bond still exists, untouched by time or silence. But what he connects to is not you. It is the symbol of you. It is his need, wrapped in your image, and in that space he feels safe. Reality, by contrast, is much more demanding. It requires effort, humility, and unpredictability. To truly connect with you would mean allowing you to respond freely, to be complex, to challenge his assumptions. In real contact, he cannot control the narrative. He cannot guarantee your reaction. He must step out of his mind and into the unknown. And that unknown is terrifying because it threatens the perfect story he has built in your absence. It threatens the comfort of knowing exactly how the imagined version of you will respond. Projection allows him to keep you in his orbit without surrendering power. He can think of you at night and feel as though nothing has changed. He can speak of you in his thoughts and imagine that somewhere you are thinking of him too. This illusion sustains him, but it also isolates him. Because as long as he lives in that dream, he is not truly living. He is not truly risking or loving or engaging with the present moment. He remains in emotional limbo, tethered to a version of you that never challenges him to grow. Fantasy offers a retreat. In the fantasy, you never moved on. You never questioned his silence. You are always open, always wait. And so he can delay the call, day after day, telling himself that there is still time, that you will still be there, that nothing real has been lost. But time does not exist in fantasy the way it does in life. In fantasy, everything is suspended. But in life, things change, people evolve, doors close. And the longer he remains in this dream, the further he drifts from the real possibility of connection. He may even tell himself that he is respecting your space, that he doesn't want to intrude, that reaching out might be selfish. But often these justifications are masks for a deeper avoidance, the avoidance of facing who he has become in your absence. Because if he calls you and you answer, and he hears the reality in your voice, warmth, coldness, confusion, indifference, it will rupture the fantasy. And once the fantasy is broken, he will have to deal with the truth that thoughts alone are not love, that memory is not commitment, that silence is not presence. What he fears most is not rejection. It is the disintegration of the internal world he has built around you. In his silence, you remain perfect. In his thoughts, he is still worthy. But in the world of real connection, everything is open, everything is uncertain, and that uncertainty demands something he may not yet possess: the willingness to be seen, the courage to speak, the capacity to hold whatever response may come. So he stays in the fantasy. He returns to it like one returns to a familiar dream. In it, he is not judged. In it, you are not hurt. In it, the story continues just as he needs it to. But this story is not real. It is a shelter built from fear and longing, not from dialogue or mutual growth. And though it feels like closeness, it is only solitude in disguise. In the vast silence that stretches between thought and action, between memory and movement, a hidden world lives. A world where desire is muffled by fear, where love is felt but not spoken, and where connection is imagined but never pursued. When he thinks of you but doesn't call, it is not a simple act of forgetfulness or detachment. It is the unfolding of deep psychological currents, shaped by wounds, projections, paralysis, and unconscious myths about what it means to love and be loved. You may look at your phone and wonder, if he cares, why doesn't he reach out? But the truth is often stranger and more haunting than it appears. He may care deeply. He may long for you in ways even he doesn't understand. But the architecture of his inner world, the archetypes he embodies, the fears he's inherited, the emotional ghosts he carries, may have built walls too thick to scale, at least for now. He lives within an internal contradiction. To call you would be to confront the very parts of himself he has spent a lifetime avoiding. So instead, he lingers in the half-light of memory and imagination, where love feels safe because it is never truly tested. The tragedy is not in the silence itself, but in the unspoken depth behind it, a soul reaching out through thought, but never voice. In this silence, we are invited to see more than absence. We are invited to understand the complexity of the human spirit, the ache for intimacy and the terror of exposure, the longing to connect and the compulsion to withdraw. This is not an excuse, but an explanation, and perhaps in understanding it, we do not wait in vain. We awaken not to his voice, but to our own.